This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Permian Basin Oil and Gas Magazine, delivering trusted oil and gas news and industry insight. We appreciate their support of real conversations like the one you're about to hear. Subscribe today at pbog.com. Hello again, this is Grant Swartzwelder, and welcome to another episode of Oilfield Strong. This episode's really got more of a personal feel to it because as a Texas A&M graduate, as an oilman, the topic today is on a subject that is kind of larger to life to most Aggies and to most oilmen. That's Clayton Williams Jr. When I went out to Midland, there was the Claydesta building. Everyone knew Clayton Williams, and you just knew that he was the oil industry. As you know, he's also a big game rancher or big game hunter, rancher. He's a oil tycoon, wildcatter, and ultimately what he achieved was to sell Clayton Williams for over $2.5 billion, a huge sum back in the days when it was actually done. So he was the epitome of being the oil man. You know, you read his book, Clayton Williams and Clady, you will see a lot of stories, but a lot of those stories have to do with later in life when he actually ran Clayton Williams and ran for governor and those type of things. What I'm interested in, though, is kind of how he became the man he was. How did he create the Clady profile, but also the Clayton Williams Companies? Because that's a whole different story, takes a whole different set of skills. Well, today our guest is a perfect one for this. We've got the Mel Riggs, who is, Mel, your title has been CFO, EVP, COO, Director, President of all the Clayton Williams Companies. You're now co-trustee of the Clayton Williams Companies, the family office. So I don't know if there's anyone that would know any more about Clayton Williams than you. And you're just also a great guy with wonderful stories. So welcome to Oilfield Strong, and I look forward to a great conversation. You know, let's start off, we can talk about all these successes, but I think reading the book, Clady, talking to you, a lot of his story begins maybe a couple of generations before. Almost starts with O.D. Williams, starts with Clayton Sr., and how all that developed. You see a lot of those, kind of a mixture of that being mushed together to make the Clayton Williams Jr. and the traits that made him a success. Talk to us about that, and let's kind of run through the chronology of how Clayton Williams became the Clayton Williams Jr. that we all know.
Okay, thanks, Grant. I appreciate this opportunity. I hope it'll be entertaining at the least, and hopefully informative. But Clayton Williams, the story, and again, this goes way back, way before my time. I've spent over 40 years with Clayton Williams and his family, going back to the beginning in 1984 when we formed a telecommunications company. That's just another story. We won't get into that story today. It's quite an interesting one, though. But Clayton wasn't an overnight success, obviously, and it took a long time for him to, as we'll talk about today, it took him quite a while to really get to have the kind of breakthroughs he eventually had. But it really started, like you mentioned, with his parenting and his grandparents going back in the 1800s. His grandfather's name was Oscar Waldo Williams, and they called him O.W. And Clayton knew him. Clayton got to be around him when he was a young boy before he passed away many years ago. But anyway, O.W. was born in Kentucky, and then his family moved to Illinois prior to the Civil War. And he had an interesting, O.W. was a guy that liked to keep diaries, write letters. He never published anything, to my knowledge, anything that was ever published, but he kept a lot of written records of his life and things that were happening. And as a young boy, he even had some interesting things happen where he got to watch Abraham Lincoln make a speech. I think Lincoln was running for senator at the time, and he said that he was very young, and he said that Lincoln was getting ready to walking up on a platform to make a speech, and his stovetop hat kind of got knocked off by a branch. That's what he kind of remembered about it, was that big hat that Lincoln wore. And so then later on, O.W. and his dad went on I'm not sure what the circumstances were. It's in Clayton's in the book that Clayton wrote. I think more details on it. But they went down. Took a long trip down the Mississippi River. And it was just after the Civil War, and it was during the daytime, and they witnessed the first daylight bank robbery ever in the United States. It was just with Jesse James and his gang. So anyway, OW was soaking up a ton of history, lots of experiences as they kind of traveled around, and so he eventually would go off to Harvard University. He earned a law degree there, and he also learned how to be a surveyor, which would come in very handy later on. And he, after getting his law degree, eventually he went back to Chicago to set up a law practice. He had a lot of health issues, mostly with his lungs. And some doctor told him that it was best for him to go west in a drier climate. And so that's what he did. He went west. He went to the Dallas area. And basically what he found out is at that point in time, there was not a lot of need for lawyers, but there was a big need for surveyors because the state of Texas had a lot of lands that were being put up, kind of opened up for homesteaders. And so he became basically leaned on his the skills he learned as a surveyor, started becoming a surveyor, going out west on different lands, went all the way across West Texas. He did the Llano Estacado area around Lubbock, surveyed there, and eventually ended up in New Mexico for a period of time. So anyway, so it was just, he saw a lot. He traveled across long distances, and I think at one point in time he was even working in some silver mines in New Mexico. He finally kind of came back from New Mexico into Texas, and he settled in Fort Stockton in 1884. He was still working as a surveyor in that area, and he basically the Fort Stockton obviously was a fort that was established by the United States government back. I don't remember what the time frame was, but to kind of help protect settlers from the Comanches and the Mescalero Apache Indians, and kind of open the path for people to live and move into expand in Texas. But OW, the fort was pretty much not in operation, and so there were buildings. The fort buildings were sort of taken over by people that sort of moved into the area, and he got one of the officers' kind of headquarters, and they took that over, and that became their home. And it's still, that building is actually, the family still owns that house. It was part of the fort at one point in time in Fort Stockton. So anyway, that was the beginning with Clayton and his actually.
That's how he got to Texas, or the family got to Texas.
Right. That's how he got there. And then Clayton's dad was actually born in Fort Stockton, I believe, in around 1895, something like that. So that time frame. So they had roots already in Fort Stockton going way back to the late 1800s. And his dad, Clayton Sr., Clayton's named after his dad. His dad went to Texas A&M to become an engineer, which he did, a civil and electrical engineer, and then went off to France, primarily in France during World War I. So he had traveled. So he spent a lot of time in Europe, and he was involved in World War I. And he came back to Fort Stockton, and later on, he became a farmer and a rancher, and for many years he was a county commissioner. And
it seemed like all his lineage had several things in common. It was there's a political element where they've been county commissioners or judges. The education seemed to be very important, and they were successful there. They also they liked history, writing, and then kind of ranch, and also military. It seemed like there's several principles that walked all the way from grandparents all the way to Clayton Jr.
That's true. And keep in mind, Texas A&M was a military school. Even when Clayton would go later to Texas A&M, attend Texas A&M, it was a military school. But Clayton also had an uncle that was really interesting guy. His name was Jesse Caleb Williams. JC, they call him JC. And JC, I don't really know a lot about his history, his education, and so forth. But he was, I believe, an engineer also. worked for one of the big major oil and gas companies, might have been Standard Oil or something like that back in the day. Lived in New York at one point, but he also spent some time in China, kind of right at the beginning of World War II with the Flying Tigers, and he was a chief intelligence officer, uh, and I believe the general was General Chenault, who was kind of running that operation, and they were basically trying to protect the Chinese from Japan. Japan was being imperialistic, and later on World War II erupted. But anyway, Clayton had exposure to these people, to his uncle, his dad, had the history of his grandfather. So you had a guy in Fort Stockton growing up that basically some of his family had seen his parents and grandparents, so forth, and uncles had seen a good part of the world. They'd done a lot of important things, and I think that kind of was part of Clayton's DNA. Actually, I mean, that became, he knew he needed to do something, to live up to what these other people in his family had been doing.
So fast forwarding from kind of how he got to West Texas and his family to kind of now he's growing up in Fort Stockton. He's heading to A&M. I don't know if there's some parts before. Obviously a great choice, but then you tell me that that he might not have actually enjoyed Texas A&M initially.
Yeah, his star, when he was in Fort Stockton, he was very active in pretty much everything in high school. He was a football player. He had a lot of jokes because I think their football team was pretty bad. I think even when he was running for governor, he tells some stories about the football, how bad they were in football. But he loved being in
Do you
sports.
recall what position he played?
I think he was a running back, tailback, or something like that. Yeah, they were in. I can't remember that
because he's not a large man. So I was wondering
he was about five.
You hear folks like that were offensive linemen back in the day. I'm like, boy, maybe he's tough, but boy, doesn't have the size.
I think he was pretty tough, but they just didn't have, they didn't have a great team. But he used to say, I think during the campaign, he always had this little joke he liked to throw out. He said, "We were 5-5. We lost 5 at home and lost 5 on the road." So something like that. That was one of his little sayings.
That's a great story.
But the other thing he started doing was his dad was farming, and Clayton he was very competitive. He told me that it not, later on, prior to passing away in back 2020, he told me that he would get out of football practice. He actually leased some land, a small tract of land. His dad was growing some cotton and out in the Belding area, kind of west of Fort Stockton. And Clayton would get off football practice, and then he'd go out to his farm, his little area, and tend to his crops. And he was sort of competing against his dad in a way, even though he was also helping his dad out. But he wanted to kind of show him that he could grow better cotton or whatever. So Clayton was always very active. Had a lot of high energy guy, and he wanted to go to A&M. His dad had gone to A&M, so he felt like he needed to go to A&M, and he knew he'd be enlisting in the military to have a 2 or 3 year, I don't remember what the term exactly was, kind of hitch in the military after that. So when he got to A&M though, it was regimented again, being military. There were no women on campus. I don't think he liked it at all. He was not really happy. And he said he would jokingly say that he spent a lot of time planning to quit A&M, and then suddenly he graduated. It just kind of like he kept making all these plans. But
in the book, it talked about how like every semester it's like, I'm going to finish this semester, then I'm going to quit, and then all of a sudden here comes another. But some of that was on his own doing, it seems like, because his mischievous side kicked in, where like I guess he went with a group of people to Baylor to steal the bear. Now he got lost; they didn't get it, but he still got punished, and so there were some things that he did that created a harder life for him, with having to do marching around and not leaving campus, and kind of his own mischievousness seemed to bear down on maybe the harshness that he had to deal with.
Yeah, well, that's true. He was somewhat a maverick, I would say. He had his own way of doing things, and the way he wanted to, entertain people and so forth. So yeah, you're right. He didn't really, and he didn't really, he did well. I think he did pretty well in college. He said he studied animal science. He really believed he was going to become a farmer and a rancher, go back to Fort Stockton and work with his dad. And then what happened, though, I guess about his junior year or so, he said that his dad started slowly selling off all of their land for various reasons. He was, a county commissioner and deciding he didn't really want to spend time. And so Clayton, he was kind of like, that was kind of a day of reckoning when he found out his dad was starting to sell, because he realized that maybe, his career was sort of like path was going to change. And so he was trying to figure out really, okay, knowing that he would have to spend a couple of years in the Army after he got out of A&M, what in the heck was he going to do?
Right.
And he was actually thinking about, because he had a science background at school, at A&M, he thought maybe he might even try to become a dentist. He was thinking about going to medical school.
And when you told me that, that surprised me because no offense to Dentist or Clayton Williams Jr., I don't see that as a match. It's he seems very energetic, very kind of, the ability to focus might not have completely been there. And I think of dentist as being just having to be able to focus right on that tooth. It just seemed like not a good match. Am I wrong, or how's that?
No, it would have been no. And not only that, but he had kind of big hands, kind of thick fingers. I don't know. I can't imagine him being a dentist, really. That would not be the way. I mean, he maybe on animals or something, but not on human beings. But he had that was and what happened eventually too. He knew the Army deal was coming. He was going to graduate and go into the Army, and then he actually, one of his uncles, a great uncle actually, who had been successful in business, kind of pulled him aside and told him. He said that the problem with going into dentistry or law, he said, those are things that you're kind of limited to your own work. And he said, that's using your hands and your mind. You're sort of limited. He said, you need to become an entrepreneur. That way you can make money on other people's work and still use your mind. That was a kind of a conversation they had. And Clayton didn't really know what that meant. What's an entrepreneur? He said but it was in his head. And he was trying to figure out, like all of us as we've come through our careers over, in the beginning, you're trying to figure out what do I do, and what are my aptitudes and so forth. So he was thinking about all this, and he kind of, while he was in the Army, he was working, he was married, and he had a young daughter that was just born, and he was working as a waiter at night to make some extra money. And it was at the Baker Hotel and Resort. It's somewhere, I think it's around in the Dallas area. But he was working as a waiter, and he would save his tip money. He would put it in a big jar, all of his tips, and that was sort of like his savings, like his it's going to be the cash that he used to go start a business or do something entrepreneurial. So he was saving for it, but wasn't a lot of money. But he knew that he had to save and start kind of preparing for whatever his next adventure was going to be, what his work life was going to be, his career.
When all those early jobs really, I think, are fascinating too. I look in his book or the biography, and there's one part in here. It's like that he's quoted as saying, "I ran my company like Christopher Columbus. When he left Spain, he didn't know where he was going. When he got here, he didn't know where he was. When he got back, he didn't know where he'd been, and he did it all on borrowed money." And when you go through these early jobs, it sure seems like that hit it right on. And maybe later on within the Clayton Williams companies that we know, maybe the same thing, but it seemed like that those initial jobs were very, he was all over the place.
Yeah, he kind of started out with he's waiting tables one night, and and there was a prominent businessman at the table, and Clayton had a flair. I mean, if he was going to be a waiter, whatever he did, he was going to do it top notch. He was going to go all out. That's one thing about, he would go, he'd do the best he could, and he had a personality. And so he was putting on his kind of show and serving this table, and this man, business guy, was there, and he told Clayton, you've got a career in life insurance. And this guy turned out to be this man was a life insurance agent, had an agency, and he wanted to hire Clayton. He said, I'm going to hire you because you've got a flair and for selling, and Clayton, considered it and thought, well, I don't really know what else I'm going to, he didn't really he still hadn't figured out what he was going to do. He said, I guess I could do that, and I can sell. And so, but he thought it over, and he decided that he didn't, and I think the guy lived in the Dallas area. I'm not sure what, Mineral Wells or someplace. But anyway, Clayton didn't really want to, said he was ready to go back to Fort Stockton, and he said, I'll go back. He decided he'd go back to Fort Stockton and become a life insurance agent for New York Life. That was his plan. So that's what they did. He and his wife and Kelby, his oldest daughter, they went back to Fort Stockton, and he started up as selling life insurance. And that, I think it went pretty well for a while, but the town, the city of Fort Stockton was about 4,000 people. And he started noticing during the day when he was walking down Main Street, which is not, it's like 3 blocks. I'm born and raised from Fort Stockton, Texas too, so I know it pretty well. But he was walking along and noticed that some of his friends started trying to avoid him. Because he had
crossing over the road to get to the other side real quick.
Yeah, they crossed the street to avoid him, and he knew because he had sold every single person in town at least something. So it was and that's when he realized, I got to find a new career. And he was trying to figure what's next for him. And so he had also become a notary public to notarize legal documents, and that came in handy because he got paid to go down to the bank, and there were typically transactions going on at the bank, a lot of oil and gas leases and so forth. People were leasing their land to oil and gas companies, and they needed documents notarized. And he got paid, I don't know how much he got paid, some amount of money for everything he signed. It wasn't a lot, but he said it was extra money. And what he noticed, though, while he was doing this, that, you had a rancher sitting there. You had the banker, the rancher, who had to own the minerals. Back in those days, pretty much a lot, this was way back before minerals had been so chopped up, but, a lot of the landowners owned all their minerals. And then there was an oil company there, and he said there was a lot of money changing hands, and he said he knew he said he didn't know much about oil and gas. They knew the rancher, and he realized that he knew pretty much all the people. I mean, the people that were doing this business, he knew them. And so he thought, well, maybe there's an opportunity there. So he decided to sort of become like a kind of a mineral buyer, or to buy minerals, or to maybe even lease and then sell the leases to some bigger company or something like that. So that's kind of, he didn't have a lot of cash though, or capital, but he had the idea. And that would later kind of he had a friend there in Fort Stockton they had known all of his life, and they formed a partnership to kind of do this kind of entrepreneurial stuff. And his name was Sean May. They came up with the name of with the company. They called it Clayjon, or Clayton and John. Right. And they launched that. And in about 1959, they started trying to buy leases, and then later on, and actually got into, there were a whole lot of other businesses that he got into that at interesting starts.
Yeah, kind of like back to that quote that yes, he did the oil and gas, but he was was it that he had a lot of energy, or that he wanted to be rich, or he just wanted to try different things? Because he created several other companies here on paper, on trucking, on bricks, along with all the oil and gas.
Yeah, what happened is they didn't really know what they were going to do exactly. They were trying to do mineral buying on this when they could. They wanted to be entrepreneurs, and actually, and it goes back to being, because he kept remembering what the the guy had said, you need to, you need to be his great uncle said, you need to become an entrepreneur. So he's trying to make it work. It's really hard though, when you're not making really any money and you've got a family and, things going on. He's still trying to sell life insurance a little bit here on the side. And actually there's an artifact in our office here. Our offices were kind of like a museum to pretty much Clayton and his history here in Clay Destin here in Midland. But Clayton, on his wall, there was a frame. I always like to look at it, but because it's kind of interesting, and he was kind of proud of it. But there was a financial statement that was framed. It was a financial statement that he submitted to a bank, to First National Bank in Fort Stockton in 1959. And it's funny because he told me some stories about it, but he told me he pretty much had the kitchen sink in this financial statement, everything he could list. And basically he listed that he had a net worth of a little over $16,000. And most of that was a house that he owned and he had a mortgage on. And then he had a bunch of other stuff that he listed as part of a farm, things like that. Pretty desk and chairs, they had the office furniture, whatever. And I don't know how much he was trying to borrow. It was his first real loan I think he ever took out. And it was for business purposes. I think it was around maybe $5,000 or $10,000. So anyway, he gets this thing, and the banker agreed to lend him the money, and a lot of it was done. I think it was you got a small town. Clayton's dad had a great reputation. His family had a great reputation, which is important for anybody starting out in business. Is to your reputation is pretty much everything. And Clayton was leaning a little bit on his parents' reputation here to try to kind of get started. And anyway, so they had Clayton said he looked at the loan and he read the loan agreement, that the note agreement, and he said that said it was odd because he said it had a 10% interest rate. And Clayton said he asked the loan officer, he said, he thought that, interest rates at that time were really about 5%. And instead of 10, and Clayton said, how come it's got to be 10? And the banker said, well, Clayton, he goes, 10% is a lot easier to multiply with. And Clayton said, okay. And he signed the note. He knew it wasn't going to win that argument. It was kind of like a high cost loan basically, but he didn't have any choice. He signed it, kind of went on. So,
well, that was one of the themes of looking at his early life. He didn't have money. And he had a reputation, but he had energy. And so he had to do some things creatively.
yeah.
And I think there's some lessons there for today's entrepreneur because, sometimes you don't have the money, you don't have certain things, and you have to kind of be creative with how you develop your business.
That's right. You have to, sometimes you have to, yeah, the interest rate may be higher or you may not get as much money, but you have to be very flexible to be able to continue on. And and then actually you mentioned earlier, he and John made the Clay-John combination. They got into a lot of different businesses trying to, other than oil and gas, they were trying, as you mentioned several things, but they had one of their businesses was this brick making company that they found out about. It was an Adobe brick machine, and it was in Arizona. Kind of a long story, but they were able to get that machine, move it to Fort Stockton, and their plan was to make Adobe bricks, which is in the soil and everything down there in that area, in that part of West Texas. You can make Adobe bricks. A lot of buildings and all the back in olden history were built by these Adobe bricks. So anyway, they were going to make these bricks, manufacture them, and then build houses. And so they finally signed a contract with a guy to build a house, and out of Adobe bricks. But they had set up their operations actually in Marfa, Texas, which is about 90 miles away, because they thought the labor down there would be cheaper. This is labor intensive, and they were going to make the bricks in Marfa, ship them over to bring them to Fort Stockton and build a house. And there's kind of a long story, but basically what they figured out after they got into this, they were already pretty deep into this, and they were building this house, but they were basically losing like 14 cents on every brick that they sold because they didn't factor in the shipping costs. So they had to finish the job. So a lot of their stuff, they had to finish the job, but they learned a lesson about really understanding your costs of things. And So he said he didn't make any. They actually lost money on this house, but that's, then they shut the brick making business down after that. Realized this isn't going to work, and so they kind of pivoted though to some other things like there was a mine in New Mexico. Ta- uh, it was a mine that a company. It was called Rare Minerals of New Mexico, and it's a tantalum. It was mining tantalum, and so they he and John put some money together because it was for sale. They'd kind of gone and inspected it and everything, and they thought this was a great opportunity. But they found out later on the mine had been salted, that somebody had taken a shotgun, they'd taken some shotgun shells, put some tantalum in the shells, and then fired it into the walls of the mine. And so salted, and basically it was a scam. And they lost I think they lost around $25,000 between the two of them on that venture. So they were struggling to really find things that they, to be successful about. So it was
you listen to some of these stories and you're like, this is not a good businessman.
And no, it was a learning. They had to learn. They did not have, they didn't have the background, but they were learning. They had to learn the hard lessons that,
Well, and that kind of ties with one of the things you've mentioned about him is that one of his phrases is, you just have to start.
Yeah, we used to talk about that a lot. We'd be, even our companies, things we wanted to do, or projects or whatever. And, sometimes there were pretty big moves that we would have to make whether it's building a gas pipeline or whatever. And he would say, well, you just have to start. And that means you just have, you just have to go do something and get, and just make it happen. And that's the way he always was. He took a lot of risk on a lot of different things, and some of them worked and some of them didn't. Like we tried a telecommunications company during the deregulation of long distance in the early mid 80s, and built a company around it. And then, we had like 1,000 long distance companies at one point in time, and it came back to about 3. And it was, but luckily we were able to sell it at a decent time. But Clayton was, he was willing to take risk and tried different kinds of businesses, and it was overall it worked out for him. But it was a hard start for him in the beginning. They struggled for years trying to find opportunities to, and eventually they.
When you say all that, I almost think of the tech bros in today's world talking about moving fast and breaking things, and and is that kind of the same? And then you think of wildcatters where they're just willing to take that risk. Is that part of the personality, or did that continue, or did he learn from these to manage risk better? What he learned from all of these, did that change how he behaved with either who he partnered with, the type projects, or is this kind of indicative of how his career and his business sense went?
Well, he was. I think he really was a risk taker. He had the ability. I mean, he had that in his genes, I believe. But he was also very measured about it. I mean, he was really good in math. He calculated things. He had he knew kind of what his situation was. But he was a risk taker. But he also had a view that he could learn quickly, and he could. I mean, he was a very, very intelligent guy, and he was a challenge to work for because he was aggressive. And sometimes we got out over our skis, and made it. Most of the time, it seemed like we were out over our skis pretty much during all of my career here. We had a lot of ups and downs. He also had this kind of, he liked to read a lot. And actually, there was a book that was published in 1959 that he got immediately when he was kind of getting in the oil business, thinking about it. And it was just written by this lady. Her name was Ruth Sheldon Knowles, and it was called The Greatest Gamblers. And it was a book about the oil business up through about 1959, and a lot of the big stories about big wildcatters and discoveries, and then companies going broke and companies going public and then going broke. And he gave, I've got a copy of it here in my office. He gave a lot of us copies of this book. And it was mostly about people that built companies and then lost them. So in the back of his mind, he always had that kind of fear. You build something, then somebody takes it away from you. And actually that became we had a little bit of a challenge. We were going to take our company public in 1993. We're in the process, or actually it was a little bit before that, maybe early 90s. We were considering taking our company public. We needed a way to access capital. We'd borrowed money. We'd done all kinds of different deals. There was not really private equity available at that point in time. But anyway, we're going public. This sort of, every once in a while, there would be sort of a window that opened where you could get a company public. So we were considering it, and he was kind of fearful of it because it took me a long time to kind of convince him, even though we didn't really know what we were doing, but basically that this was going to be an opportunity for our company to have some longevity and be capitalized properly, because he was worried about, he'd read so many stories about how people lost companies. So he, in the back of his mind, he was always concerned about those kind of things. It's kind of a little bit old fashioned from that standpoint, but it was based on some actual facts and things that had happened in the past.
So he would take all these risks, and another phrase that you have thrown out before about that he never wanted to be comfortable. It's almost like he wanted to throw himself into situations for the fun of it, or to see how it works, or the challenge. Help me understand kind of that thought process of never being comfortable and how that kind of fits with the need to take risk.
I don't know if I can really, that's just a personality trait, I think. But he trying to think how to frame this, but he liked,
He was a
loved
wildcatter.
business. Yeah, he liked it. He liked the excitement of it. He obviously wanted to make money. He wanted to, but I think it goes back to a lot of his, early his parenting and his, the history of his grandparents, and they did things. And I think he wanted to go out and do things. He was a doer. He didn't, he was up to any kind of a challenge, so, he could have cashed out and walked away, many years earlier, and but he always wanted, he was a doer. He liked to be doing things, and it made him, and really it was fun. It was really fun, and it was fun. He enjoyed the journey, and that's one thing again for young people starting out, entrepreneurs or whatever. that it is a journey. It's kind of cliche, but he enjoyed every moment of it, even in the worst of times. We still kind of laugh about things, even though we knew that we didn't look very smart at different points in time. But he just enjoyed it. He enjoyed people. It was, in all of our different companies, and he
was very entrepreneurial, loved to be in different companies. The thing that's always of interest on that is, what if he had just stayed focused on one thing? Would he have been more of a success? It sounds like it's just not possible for him to be focused on one thing. But, we both talked to a lot of folks that, get involved in a lot of things versus staying focused and really building that. What do you think of that concept and how that would apply to his life?
He did tend to be somewhat, he'd have a lot of irons in the fire. There'd be a lot of different projects and a lot of different things going on. It was like, but they all sort of in a way tied together to some extent. He got into he was drilling, for natural gas, eventually created Clayton Gas, with a very large midstream company at one point in time, of processing and processed gas too, mostly in the Austin Chalk and in the Giddings area. He had that. Things were sort of like synergistic in a way, but he'd go off and do, start a bank here in Midland, create the largest hunting safari company in Africa, with concessions in multiple countries. He was into all the oil and gas stuff, mud business, pipe business. Of course, we had telecom. And he liked to start up other businesses, and eventually, though, we would usually, there'd be things that didn't work, and we'd sell things and kind of regroup and kind of consolidate. And that's just the kind of way he kind of ran things. So he had a lot of energy and a lot of imagination, and probably would have been better. You're right. I mean, being focused on one thing is probably maybe a better path to being successful. But
It sounds good, but I don't think he had it within his being to do that.
no, just he had a lot of fun. I mean, yeah, he enjoyed it, and being very expansive and taking risk, and it all. If you go back to the very beginning, I mean, the very first lease that it was a pretty significant lease that he was chasing early on. He and John May, actually, and this guy, his name was last name was Merrick, and he lived in Philadelphia, and he had some acreage, some minerals out in Pecos County, and so Clayton, and actually the guy had been the reason Mr. Merrick had been Clayton's dad's partner. They had a movie theater operation in Fort Stockton at the time, and then anyways they'd sold it. But Merrick
Now, wait a minute. This is probably the most important question.
Yeah.
Stockton was big enough to actually have a movie theater?
It definitely was.
All right. Well,
Yeah. Yeah, it was big enough for a movie theater.
so says a very proud Fort Stockton resident.
Yeah, it was it was the towering. Actually, I was in high school when this happened, but in Fort Stockton, I went to the movies one night, and the next morning I found out the movie theater had burned down during the night. After I walked out, was something kind of a long story, but the movie theater burned down. And actually, in the local newspaper, the next movie that was coming was The Towering Inferno. I always thought there was some irony in it.
I think there is.
Yeah. So anyway, with Clayton, his dad, Clayton wanted this lease, and but he had to go to Philadelphia, and so he flew. I don't know if he drove to Dallas. He had to go through Dallas. He got to Dallas and found out that the plane he was going to be on, it wasn't a plane he was going to be on, but it was a turbojet. It was Electra turbojet. This is in 1960. This Electra turbojet, somewhere had crashed, and they were investigating, and that was the kind of plane he was going to fly to Philadelphia. So they grounded everything, and so he had to sit in the airport, spent the night sitting in the airport. Finally, he got a flight out of there, got to Philadelphia, and he went to Mr. Merrick's house, actually, and try to get the lease signed. And Mr. Merrick told him, he said, "Son, there's a lot of people that want this lease." And he goes, "I got another group coming over here any minute now." And he said, but you just stay here. But when they get here, I want you to run upstairs and hide, and then I'll deal with these other guys, and then we'll talk later. So anyway, this other group comes trying to get the lease. Merrick talks to him, and then later he gets Clayton back downstairs, and then anyway, he was fond of Clayton because of the connection with Clayton's dad and everything. So Clayton got the lease. He signed this lease, and it was a big deal. And and it was done primarily because, I guess, the friendship with his dad. So
Sure.
He comes back to Fort Stockton. They drill a well. He and John May drill a well. It's flowing like 50 barrels a day. This is their first well they drilled, and so they thought it was. I thought they were rich. And he said the first thing they did was they went out and bought two. They each went and bought a brand new 1960 Oldsmobile for each of the wives. And then as soon as they did that, he said the production started declining on the well. It was still commercial, and ultimately they drilled. It was still making a little bit of money, but they ended up drilling two more wells on this lease, both non-commercial. And then one dry hole. So and actually, though, they can. This is typical people. I mean, for entrepreneurs thinking about when you're starting out, they considered it a success, though, even though it wasn't a monetary success. But they had actually they were successful because they had actually become oil operators. That's what they wanted to do, become an oil operator. They were in the business, and that's kind of what. So if you think about all that with Clayton, they had a heck of a lot of fun. There was a lot of trouble, a lot of, I'm sure, anxiety about things that were happening, but they had a lot of fun doing what they were doing. So it was just, and I think he just fed on that, he loved that kind of, that, that kind of, I guess, drama. I don't know, I guess, but it was,
Through all of this, it seems like he has a certain relationship with or comfort with the potential of failure, that
mhm.
he's able to look at it in the eye and get past it. Is that true? And how
Yeah,
is he able to,
no,
he just
yeah,
understands that's part of the game?
yeah, that's part of the, yeah, I think, no, I think he had the ability to kind of deal with that and try to do better. He did a deal. He had a great opportunity. He had the natural gas business at one point where he was had built some pipelines. And actually, when he built pipelines out of the Cayenosa area of West Texas, in Pecos County, there's
Sure.
a lot of deep gas wells out there, deep 20,000 foot Ellenberger wells. That was all happening in the '60s, and he 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 was able to go and get gas, or basically able to buy build some little pipelines, get deals done with these oil and gas companies for supplies of gas. And he was actually they dug a lot of their own. He helped dig a lot of the pipeline trenches and so forth to get gas to farmers and stuff. But he had a big opportunity with the city of Fort Stockton. Had a need for a new gas contract for the city's municipal supply. So he jumped all over it and he went off, and he knew he had to get some gas from from somebody, a gas supply, so he can make a bid on this opportunity and build a pipeline and so forth. So to the city's supply system. So anyway, he goes and he went off and he got a volume of gas committed from a deep gas well, and it was an Ellenberger, I believe, an Ellenberger well at huge reserves. But he could able to buy a little piece of it, and he was able to go then to the city and bid on this contract. And it was a fixed price contract. He won the bid, and he was kind of in the gas business because one thing he had learned is that trying to drill oil and gas wells, doing a third for a quarter, promoting and all that. He said it was a kind of a tough game, and there was no steady cash flow, and he was trying to create some sort of the gas business would be steady cash flow for him. And so it was going great until sometime suddenly the price of gas starts moving up, and gas had just been flat forever, and all of a sudden its prices are rising for what the event was that caused this to happen. And he was unfortunately locked into a situation where he had a floating rate of a gas price on his supply, and then on the offtake to the city, they were on a fixed price contract. So he was underwater on every MCF he sold to the city. And he said that he was kind of in a position where either he had to just basically he said he just had to eat it, because he said if he had tried to get out of that contract, it would have totally ruined his reputation.
Yep.
And so he basically just had to bear the losses for quite a while before he was able to adjust the price later on. Contractually, there were some price adjustment opportunities later, but it took several years, and so he lost money on on every MCF he sold.
But it was important enough for his reputation to do so.
Reputation was everything. He knew if he walked away from it or tried to,
Retrade
his
it or
reputation there would be, it was going to be ruined. So that was a tough deal, but he kept going, and he just he seemed to be able to. He was resilient, seemed to be able to bounce back from the setbacks. So, which I think you have to be, because anytime you're starting in business, you never know where it's going to take you.
I'd agree. Mel, I really appreciate your time. We're out of time. Unfortunately, I could keep talking to you about the stories of his life. And I know we didn't talk about Loving County, a variety of other things that I think would have been very fascinating. But, it's not often you get to kind of talk to someone that really knows the legend in the industry and kind of understand what their thought process was on business, on entrepreneurship, and I really appreciate you kind of opening the curtain a little bit and letting us kind of see what Clayton Williams Jr. was all about. He's a legend in the oil field, a legend in the Texas Aggies mind, and so really appreciate you spending time. If you like what you're hearing, please go onto YouTube and follow and connect. Please share this with other individuals that might be of interest on this. This is going to be a series that we do about how different people get started, because that first period of time is the hard part. You always hear people making the first million is hell, the second million is inevitable. And as you heard through here, Clayton Williams Jr. went through hell for a period of time until he became the instant success 20 years later or so. So thank you for participating. Thank you, Mel, for being my guest today.
Thanks, Brandon. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure and check out Permian Basin Oil and Gas magazine for deeper industry coverage and analysis. Thanks to PBOG for supporting Oilfield Strong and helping to amplify these important conversations. Subscribe today at pbog.com.